You so tiebreakers, really fucking confusing when you have multiple teams tiebreaking. So as of right now, there are your 2 and 3 teams, which is what we want to matter. So we're gonna go to COD Gamepedia real quick and scroll down to Major One, and you're gonna see this is the current standings, right? So you have 4 teams locked in. You have Paris Legion knocked out, right? So the matches that matter tomorrow are Atlanta v New York, even though it doesn't really matter for Atlanta because unless they get 3-0'd, they're gonna have the 1 seed because they have the tiebreaker advantage over. They have the tiebreaker advantage over LA Thieves because they beat them. If there's a 3-way tie, if there's a 4-way tie, then it gets really complicated. But in general, right now Atlanta has the tiebreaker advantage for first place. And it obviously it will depend if we get like 3-0 tomorrow versus New York. Obviously that can change. But the other match that matters is the Optic Texas versus Boston match. So one of these teams will be finishing 3-2, which will add into this clusterfuck that I'm about to show you guys. So right now, Toronto, this isn't updated. Toronto is 3-2 as well. One of these 2 teams, Optic and Boston, will be 3-2. LA Gorillas is 3-2. Florida 3-2. Minnesota 3-2. And if New York can be 3-2 if they beat us tomorrow. So that makes a lot of confusing stuff, right? So here is the bold is guaranteed, and these teams could be. And this is their overall map win rate right now, currently. As you can see, Optic has been actually doing really, really well. They're 10-6. That 3-0 yesterday really helped. But so let me explain how the tiebreakers go. So this is what's on the CDL site. If you go to the CDL standings, this is what gets shown, right? So you would think, right, it would go head to head, and then it would go here, and then it would go here, and then it would go here. But what I got told today is that the way that the ties go is if a team gets tied together. So let's say it's these 4 teams tie up together. It's the head-to-head match win rate against these teams, just these teams, not everyone else, right? And then contrary to how it used to go, is you would have that one tiebreaker with all of them, and then they would get seeded off of that. Because for the major, it has to be seeded individually, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It has to be seeded individually. They break it down weirdly where it has been broken down before. And so that's where if you get a 6-way tie, this is going to get pretty mixy. So I broke down here are the map records against each other so far. Obviously, the New York and Optic one doesn't really matter to any of these tiebreakers for the map and series count because obviously only one of them will be there. So the map count against each other will not matter. So you have to take that into account. The only thing that matters is if Boston and Texas, whoever wins that one, and then whether Atlanta beats New York or not. Okay, so those are the only 4 scenarios that we have to really consider. So let's get into it. This is going to be the series count. This is pretty key. So this is the first tiebreaker. Everything's going to rely on the series count, right? So the map count is second. The series count is first, right? And then is overall match, which is here. But obviously, if they're all 3-2, they're all going to be tied, which brings it to the overall game. Game is just another word for maps. So that's what we're going to have right here. So that's what's going to be a tiebreaker for some of these scenarios down below. So just remember that. So scenario number 1, Boston beats Texas. Atlanta beats New York, right? So you're gonna have a 5-way tie if that happens. You're gonna have LAG, Florida, Minnesota, Toronto, and Optic, right? Now the way this is gonna go, how this normally wouldn't go, is it's gonna go based off one at a time gets knocked out, and then they redo it from the top, right? So ready? You add up all the series counts head to head against each other, and unfortunately, LA Gorillas have an 0-2 record, so they're out of here, right? LAG eliminated first and then you would rerun it with the remaining 4 teams, right? You take LAG out of the equation. You would take all of this out, and then you rerun it. So now you have Florida with 0-1 record. They're next out. So you knock out Florida, right? So Florida and LAG would be the 2 teams getting eliminated, with New York and Paris in this scenario. Toronto, Optic, and Minnesota would make it out. In the final, just to determine 6, 7, and 8, you would have here in this final section. So in this final section, you have Minnesota, Toronto, and Optic. So unfortunately, because Optic beat Toronto and Toronto hasn't played Minnesota, again, this is why I hate that we don't have groups because some of these teams are not playing each other, so it doesn't really make it fair. But Toronto is knocked out with an 0-1 record. They're out of here. It's 2 teams, and this is where Minnesota's 3-2 victory over Optic on the first week actually matters. So they're going to get the 6th seed over Optic due to that tiebreaker. All right, scenario number 2, Texas and Atlanta win. So this has Boston and New York losing. So this is very similar to the one before, where you're going to have Boston in here instead of Texas, okay? So it's still no New York in this scenario, no Paris in this scenario. They're already gone. This one again, LAG 3-0. You're out of here. Okay, that's right off the rip. Then you re-roll it. You go down to here, right? Florida again, 0-1. So this is actually kind of confusing. I don't know how the CDL are going to handle this, just because Minnesota and Boston actually haven't played any of these three teams, so they have a 0-0 record, right? I don't know how they're going to handle this, because I think this is extremely unfair. Just because Florida and Toronto are the only ones that have played, they get the shit end of the stick on this, which kind of sucks for them. Uh, you know, I really wish this wasn't the case. I hope it's not. I hope I'm actually wrong about this one in particular, just because I don't know how they're going to rule these double zeros here. But in this mocked up scenario that I have for right now, it has Florida being eliminated, which again would have Florida and LAG joining New York and Paris in the lower bracket for the major, and Toronto, Boston, and Minnesota making it out. Here's the final part of it, which actually it goes into overall map win record. It goes to the fourth tiebreaker. So you have Minnesota, Toronto, and Boston who have not played each other. So it goes to the overall map count. And you might be saying, but what if Boston has a different result, right? Well, the worst result Boston can have is an 0-3 versus Optic, which would make it 9-12, right? Which puts them at a 42.9 map win rate, which is still better than Minnesota, which means Minnesota is out of here. Which leads to the final one, which again has Toronto versus Boston, which again goes down the map win rate. So the best scenario Boston can have is a 2-3 loss, right? To be in the scenario and have the best decision. So that would be +2 and +3, which will put them at 47.8, which is still worse than Toronto's. But actually, now that I look at this, Toronto hasn't had their current map record inputted, so you would have to do, they finished 9-9, which is 50, so they are still ahead, and they would still be ahead as well here, right? You would still be, eliminated there, and you would still be eliminated here. So as unfortunate that is, that's going to be, bam, right? Scenario number 3, this is where it starts getting mixy, right? This is where if Texas beats Boston and New York manages to knock off Atlanta, which, literally anything can happen. I'm not going to put any bad juju out there. Literally anything can happen right now, and a lot of teams are grinding. New York look amazing today, so, they could easily come out with a fire tomorrow. So in this one, there are a 6-way tie. It's actually pretty goddamn crazy. This is part of the reason why I really hate the CDL structure this year, because you can have a 6-way tie. Like, it's confusing. It's not good for the casual viewer, right? And technically, you could even have a greater team tie if two teams go 0-5, right? There is a way to get even more teams tied into one. So this is not something that is easily talked about on the broadcast, which is the reason why I don't like it. So in this one, 6-way tie, you take all the series records against each other and you combine it into one. You have New York 0-1, you have Florida 0-1, right? So those two are the worst. So how do you break that down? You go to overall map record. And again, this is where I hope I'm wrong. It could be different. It could be the overall map record of all these teams. But right now, New York is losing. And if, best case scenario, again, they go 7 + 2 and then +3. You're still at 33.3, which again would be the worst record out of anybody here, which would either way knock them out first in this scenario. Which, after after the first week, it was obviously rough, but they came back. They're fighting back. So hopefully they have a fire at the major, even with this. Now we go into the next team that would be eliminated. So again, you take New York out, reset it, run it from the top, right? And this would have the LA Gorillas going 0-3, which would knock them out, which puts them eliminated. And then the final team would be Florida, because they go 0-1. Again, this is maybe where it might be different. I really hope it is, just because I think it's a little bit unfair for Minnesota and Boston, who hasn't played any of these teams. Again, please, CDL, bring back actual groups. And this is where you have Florida being knocked out. LAG, Florida, New York, and Paris would be the teams knocked out. And then the final 3 teams you can see right here, Toronto, Boston, Minnesota, which again, I actually had incorrect here. So I'm going to update it real quick. In this scenario, you're going to have Minnesota, Toronto, and Boston. Obviously, Minnesota's has 9-13. Boston, they could be at worst right here if they get 0-3 by Texas, right? That's at worst, so which would still have Minnesota being knocked out. And then it goes into the final tiebreaker, which again, at best, you could have, for Boston to be in the scenario and have the best, it would be a 3-2 loss, which would be here, which would still be a lower overall map win rate compared to Toronto, which would have them finish 7th and Toronto 6th. Now, the final scenario, you have Boston and New York, right? If both of those teams win, again, we have a six-way tie, and it gets mixy, which, again, best case scenario, you have a 7 in 14, which is a 33% win percentage. It's still last, even if they do change it to overall map record for these six, because two teams tied. I really don't know how they're going to break this down. It's really confusing. And that's why I tried to ask a lot of questions about it, but it's very confusing. And I really do hope they run this through the broadcast tomorrow to actually describe like how everything's going to go. The final one is, or the next one is LAG. So unfortunately, once you take New York out of here, they have an 0-2 record, which is worse technically than the 0-1 record than Florida has. So again, that would be elimination for LAG. So this basically confirms that LAG has a 0% chance to make winner's bracket. They will now be confirmed in lower bracket. The next elimination would be Florida. As you can see here, they're 0-1 versus the remaining teams. This would knock them out. So Florida, ninth, and ninth. So Florida is now 100% guaranteed lower bracket with LAG, with Paris, and unfortunately with New York. So unfortunately, all this is really doing is just figuring out the 6th, 7th, and 8th seed. Even though this is a lot of like craziness, I guess that's the simplest way to do it. Is Florida, LAG, New York, and Paris are eliminated, unfortunately, and then you would have Paris, Optic, in Toronto, or Paris or Toronto, Optic, in Minnesota, or you could have a combination of Boston, Toronto, and Optic. There's a bunch of different ways to break it down, but basically, if you guys want to go through this again, feel free to. Hopefully, again, there are some scenarios where I just don't know how they're going to break it down. It's very confusing. Hopefully we do get some clarity. Like like this scenario is pretty key. But either way, you're gonna have New York get eliminated, even if they do that. So there are some places where I'm not quite 100% sure, but it's still kind of set in stone. So hopefully you guys did enjoy this, and hopefully they explain this tomorrow. And hopefully I'm not too wrong here, because based off what I got told, based off somebody that's close to the like understands the or the tiebreaker process. This is the way how it's going to go down. But hopefully, there are some little things where they could change. So, good luck to all the teams tomorrow, and hopefully, the major is going to be amazing. I cannot wait to watch that.